Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah, and I'm a senior at Wesleyan University. And today I will be talking about our work investigating preschool-age children's use of spatial thinking when making sense of astronomical phenomena. So a little bit of background. We live in an inherently spatial world, and thus spatial thinking is essential for us to be able to function in our everyday lives. Previous research has shown that spatial skills are correlated both with future academic achievement and that early spatial skill development is predictive of later interest in STEM subjects. Previous research has also shown that different science domains support children's engagement in a wide range of spatial skills, which means that each science domain should be studied individually in order to understand which spatial skills are supported by those topics. So our specific research problem that we wanted to address was to what extent do museum astronomy programs encourage preschool age children to engage in spatial sense-making practices and the inferred spatial skills. And I'll go into a little more detail about the specific definitions of those terms. And overall, we wanted to contextualize the use of spatial skills in a museum program setting in order to provide evidence that preschool age children use these skills to make sense of astronomical phenomena. And this can thus be later used in curriculum development. So we used two different frameworks for our study. The first framework looked at spatial skills. And spatial skills are specific transferable cognitive processes. So this framework had two levels of analyses. One was the spatial skill quadrants, which are broad categories that classify spatial skills along two axes, shown to the right. So these two axes are, the first one is intrinsic to extrinsic, and the second one is static to dynamic. So intrinsic is just looking at one object, and then extrinsic is comparing multiple objects. Static is looking at properties that don't involve motion, and then dynamic is looking at properties that do involve motion. So there are four quadrants: intrinsic static, intrinsic dynamic, extrinsic static, and extrinsic dynamic. And examples of specific spatial skills include perspective taking, which is the switching of reference frames. So such as thinking about the moon phases, both from the moon's reference frame as well as from the Earth's reference frame, as well as describing relative size, which is comparing the external sizes of different objects. So basically what we would do is that we would investigate the specific spatial skill as well as what broader category it fell into of those four quadrants. So that was the first framework with those two levels. And the second framework we were looking at was the spatial sense-making practices. So these are directly observable behaviors from which we inferred the children's use of those cognitive spatial skills. And examples of these include gestures, so just like hand motion, describing size, it's big or small, and then sketching, such as drawing the positions of different objects. So just to kind of summarize that, overall, we had two frameworks that we were looking at, the cognitive processes, which are the spatial skills, and then the behaviors, which are the spatial sense-making practices. And then the spatial skills had two levels, both the specific skill being used, as well as the broader category that that skill was included in. So the sample that we used, we looked at programs at a small science center in the northeastern United States in a high socioeconomic status university town. We looked at 7 different museum astronomy programs, each of which was designed for 3 to 5-year-olds. So the programs ranged in sample size individually from 5 to 15 children and covered the 7 different topics, including shadows, moon phases, lunar craters, Martian landscapes, Earth's rotation, stellar distances, and constellations. And on the right is an image of the video data that we were using to investigate the spatial skills that the students were employing. So this is from our moon phases matching program. And to just kind of give you an example of what the coding process looked like, this is an excerpt from the moon phase program, where the students were learning about how the moon phases involve the moon appearing different sizes and how that there's a pattern to the change in the size. So in this example, the educator asked the children what happens to the way that the moon looks. And then one child replied, it gets smaller and smaller like this, and then made a pinching motion with his fingers, indicating the smaller size. And then it gets full like this. And the boy used his hands to make a circular shape. So in this excerpt, we coded the behaviors, the spatial sense-making practices, as spatial talk because he was using words like small and full, and then gesture because he was using his hands to describe that size. So small, round. And then the specific spatial skill quadrant that this fell under was extrinsic static because he was comparing the external properties of multiple objects. So these are our findings for each of the 7 programs. You can pause the video here to just take an in-depth look at these. But the main takeaways are that 6 of the 7 programs supported extrinsic static spatial skills. So that was by far the most common quadrant used by the children. And then the most common spatial skills, one of which was describing relative size. So that's comparing the size of multiple objects. And then some of the most common sense-making practices were object manipulation, so holding objects and moving them around, as well as spatial talk, so describing the spatial characteristics of different objects. So overall, there are 3 main findings that we took away from this investigation. One was that children most commonly used extrinsic static spatial skills, as you saw from the table on the previous slide. And this meant that they were often comparing static traits of multiple objects. Our second main finding was that all identified spatial sense-making practices facilitated multiple spatial skills. So this means that the children are using strategic spatial behaviors, those sense-making practices, to engage with multiple astronomical concepts. More specifically, each of the 5 spatial sense-making practices facilitated 2 or more spatial skills when we were looking across all of the programs. And then our third finding is that 3 programs engage children in 2 spatial reasoning quadrants, while 4 programs engage children in only 1 spatial reasoning quadrant, which means that none of the programs engage children in all 4 of the spatial skill quadrants. And further analysis is needed to determine whether this is because of the phenomena, the types of activities, or other factors. So in summary, children most often compared static traits of multiple objects, and that the children use spatial strategies to facilitate multiple spatial skills. Additionally, children engage spatial skills in only 1 or 2 of the 4 broad categories in each of the programs, which means that the program supported a narrow range of spatial skills. So overall, the big takeaway is that while museum programs do facilitate children's spatial thinking, multiple programs around a range of astronomy phenomena are needed to engage children in all 4 spatial skill quadrants. Here's some references from throughout the presentation. Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Hannah. I'm a senior at Wesleyan University applying to grad programs this fall, and I would love to get in contact with you. Here's my email address if you have questions or if you would like to get in touch. Thank you very much.